And I want to welcome everybody, and especially the poets tonight, in behalf of my children and I, who've decided that we will continue this wonderful place, this sacred place that my husband and in behalf of James, who has set up so many wonderful readings here. And actually, Fiona, I don't know if you all know Fiona, she's volunteered here she's a homeschooler who's volunteered here for, I don't know, how long, Fiona? Has it been?
Since September of last year.
Yeah. So we have a nice crew. And there's about, how many, 30 or 50? 30?
She's about there.
There's quite a few people on Zoom, and this is the Zoom camera. So welcome to you, Zoom people. And you're in for a wonderful reading, so thank you for being here. Oh, Fiona's going to introduce you.
Hi, my name is Fiona Wolf, and I have the pleasure of introducing the readers for tonight. First up will be Angelo Nikolopoulos. He's the author of Obscenely Yours, published by Alice James Books in 2013, Pleasure, published by Four Way Books in 2022. His poems have appeared in Best American Poetry, Best New Poets, Boston Review, Fence, Los Angeles Review, Tin House, and elsewhere. Winner of the Discovery/Boston Review Poetry Prize, he's received fellowships from the Jerome Foundation, MacDowell Colony, and Saltonstall Foundation for the Arts. A former instructor for Teach for America, he has taught creative writing at New York University and Rutgers University. He teaches at Hunter College and lives in Brooklyn, New York. And our second reader for the night will be Paul Tran. They're the author of the debut poetry collection, All Flowers Kneeling, from Penguin Poets in February 2022. Their work appears in The New Yorker, The Nation, Best American Poetry, and elsewhere. A recipient of the Discovery/Boston Review Poetry Prize, as well as fellowships from the Poetry Foundation and the National Endowment for the Arts. Paul is a visiting faculty in poetry at Pacific University MFA in writing, and a Wallace Stegner Fellow in poetry at Stanford University. Welcome.
It's so cute and lovely to be here. I've never been here before, and we came in first and we saw the bookstore, and I thought, oh, it's such a lovely place to do a reading, and I love that I'm in this little nook and I'm sort of reading to friends and I'm sitting. So I'll read a little bit from this book that just came out called Pleasure. I wrote it one summer when I lived on a small island in Greece called Syros, which incidentally Paul visited 2-3 years ago, right? And so we were sort of reminiscing about our shared recollections of the island. And I went to this island because I hadn't written anything in a long time, and I knew that if I forced myself, something would come of it. And I went in thinking that I wanted to explore these ideas of isolation and solitude, and as you'll see, I struggled with that. It's a book-length poem, and so it reads chronologically, and so I'll start from the beginning, and then I won't skip. I'll just go through, and then I'll see where I stop. Hermopo's Port, arrival scene. Through the hall's opening and erotics of contrast, a handsome priest, trim beard, silver hair, lifts the hem of his gown and fastens himself behind a boy no older than 16, lurid tan legs, who revs his motorcycle through the sweaty crowd. I exit the ship's bowels. A type of luxury. Encased in myself, I walk along the port, admiring somatic codes. A fisherman hauling his load, a woman through a window extending her neck, If I could eat them all, I believe I would. In the Venn diagram of the heart, how do pleasure and solitude overlap? I am a foreigner dressed in black, besotted, the word itself a type of luxury, with the privilege of my own seaside sadness. That beauty exists outside myself is a consolation, like watching love happen elsewhere. When I pause at the steps of the cathedral, it is in a young girl's baptismal gown, as white as inexperience. Lift the hem of your dress, her father says, so it doesn't get dirty. I wasn't going to stop and talk between, but Paul and I were talking about how this cathedral that I just mentioned happens to sit directly next to a casino on the island, and we thought it was such a beautiful contrast between virtue and vice. Anyway, that's an aside. Beyond language. A row of 7 cypress trees, religiously tall, hedges the field below, itself in turn water-hedged by mineral coastal blue. Why 7? Why have you come here? Not another soul for miles. You will find much beauty here, Mrs. Iorana says, opening the balcony door. Beneath the field, though I've yet to see it, a cliff points over the craggy shore. I came to test whether it's true, if the best things happen to you when you're alone. Maybe in the end you'll find nothing useful here, my mind says. You are old, you have done terrible things. In the dusk, beyond language, the field empties itself of color. Paul and I also talked about how both our mothers are aware of our books, but my mother cannot read in English, and so I feel some safety in knowing that she can never read my poetry, because as you'll soon notice, I often disclose things that I don't think she'd be happy about. Balcony scene. The horizon in June is as clear as a whale, that's W-A-I-L. In isolation, the self unspools as much as it reaches for meaning. The word solitude arrives in 14th century Old French via the Latin solitudo. It implies being alone in a desolate place, a desert, or a wilderness. I'm unaroused by this image, but the French soul, bachelor unaccompanied, borrows from Saul, Germanic for soul. My heart in its smoky boudoir smells like a bladder. There's no way of knowing if this linguistic kinship is real or imagined, but I am certain of the divine velour of solitude swathing me at day's end, the words hardly necessary. Because of its silence, this balcony, a stage for my selfishness, encases the white noise of my soul. Weeks ago, incomprehensibly alone in the waiting room of Huntington Memorial, while Mother's brain tumor was removed, I imagined the clutter of the operating room ripe with activity. It disgusted me to think of it, as the man beside me, bulging and specific, had appalled me. I collapsed into myself. This island is a cluttered room too, cafe lined with laughter. I drive up the narrow dirt road. I am a singular light source above the cove. At the home's threshold, I find it too precious for what I intend to do. Balcony scene, laptop lit. I jerk off unromantically to straight marine fucking older. Below, the dark water goes. SOS. I am, if nothing else, unmonitored. Waking in the afternoon, I pick a fig from the tree and I do not eat it. In the murk. I dislike the beach beneath the cliff. The mossy stones absorb the sun, negating the charm of swimming in the Aegean Sea, the sensation of being suspended in light. Because it is privatized, a perk, I share its disappointment with no one, a lack. It is like knowing the displeasure of your own face. I floated in the murk. The solitary state is a neutralized zone, prone to the delicacy of drifting, where I am neither myself nor anybody else's, neither subject nor object, but an absence held in a punctuated stream of boredom, a dull agitation. When I float in the sea, I am like the removed pit of a fruit or the hollow it leaves behind. Alone, I am cored and sexless. Later, at a grocery store, a woman's odor offends me. In my revulsion, I am pure identity. In the car, 5 tomatoes, white wine on the passenger seat, trigger the seatbelt chime. From the field. At the foot of my bed this morning, a newborn scorpion, so new to the world, I thrashed its translucent flesh with the heel of my shoe. The terrible thing about nature is how it could end you always and instantly, but that you could never kill it all entirely, not at once. The roof is the farthest from the dirt and the ideal place to stand against the wind. Mother immigrated to the U.S. in 1977 into the suburban sprawl of the San Gabriel Valley, a village so dead and quiet I'd never seen. Mother hated nature because she lived in it as a child. Father chose her the way one chose a dog, the healthiest among the village lot. The day's harvest. One can experience loneliness in 2 ways, by feeling lonely in the world or by feeling the loneliness of the world. Picking chamomile from the field, I roam the seaside. I bend open-palmed toward the earth. I think my mother would like that poem. The edge. My body exists for itself in 2 general forms, boredom and hysteria, each an appetite, what I put into myself. If I smoke too early, it will ruin the entire day. Here's what I did with my body. Collected moon-colored stones, watered the basil, swept the marble floors for the pleasure of the sound, picked and carried ripened figs in the fold of my shirt, something seen in the film. I walked to the edge of the cliff and I walked myself back. What I ingest, white wine, panoramic view, comes out of my body, pissing off the cliff, aesthetic fatigue. There is no other way. I am cruising because I'm alive. It is a reflexive desire, squashing the scorpion, when faced with self-annihilation at the edge of the cliff that pulses. The body says to the mind, let me live, but it cannot. One pleasure replaces another. There is no progress. Tell you what for. SOS. If it's true that there is someone for everyone, which is to say, someone will find you beautiful, it must also be true that there will always be someone who finds you repulsive. In the dull village, the bed is warm, but I do not lie down again. Your own hysteria. This poem is not about Paul. A poet I despise has won a prize. Everything's unchanged in this wooden kitchen, in my filthy clothing, yet my personhood's tendrils extend immeasurably beyond me. I exist in the world by proxy. To know this is like floating in the cobbled sea, suspended in the murky water. If suffering is a puncture it points outward. Like a pronged apparatus, it emits as much as it receives. Its force whetted by the absence of locality. In the hospital room, the nurse asked Mother, "Show us where it hurts." She pointed to her own skull. "From 1 to 10, how do you rate your pain?" In the corner of the room, based on the mantel, wildflowers deteriorate, their tendrils glassy, languished. How do you begin to remedy when pain emanates as an aftershock? When a flower begins to die, its stem loses water, causing cells to burst. Eventually, membranes disintegrate. This is wilting. This is, for the flower, a catastrophe. And yet, being aware of your own hysteria won't diminish it. Pain is a translation, a gradient of injustice. Far away on 14th Street, my dentist drills into someone else's open mouth. I'll read two. Part of it. A feral cat, skittish yet curious, on the balcony this morning. Feeding him cold cuts by hand is strangely pleasurable, like being chosen for a dance. Sunrise scene, horizon as blue scale punctured by pastel, provokes mild joy. Agnes Martin says, if you get up in the morning and you feel really happy and everything seems good, that's without cause. When the cat has finished with the meat, he returns to the field below. What Agnes means is, sometimes you just can't help yourself. There's a slight excitement, a faint image that survives briefly until supplanted by another. It is a vagueness. And also she means, sometimes you want to die. The field below is now fully animated, bright pastoral buzzing, and yet I am hardly part of it. When I look out across the waves beneath the cliff, I have no desire to plunge into them. Where it ended. In the morning twilight, in a quiet hysteria, I test my fear of nature along the desolate coastline. The stones radiate their own temperature and odor. I walk to the farthest point along a slate of rock, and then the cruelest blue. Why do I say fear? Don't you adore the green grass, Mary Oliver, with its terror beneath? For what is the grass, Whitman anachronistically, but the beautiful uncut hair of graves? I do not adore the grass, but my feelings toward the sea cucumber are tender. Laguna Tide Pools High School, I discovered one, green and translucent, marooned in a shallow pool. Because I could not flagellate myself, I prodded it with a stick. Agitated, it expelled white, sticky filaments. Looks like cum, someone said. Why is the melancholic man lyrical? Why does he walk barefoot to the farthest point? What does he remember? In our last bed, G was high on acid. When he began to wet himself, and I felt the urine soaking through the linens, I pressed into him until I no longer knew where the wetness began and where it ended. I imagined our young love spanning outward from our wet embrace, as if from a radiation zone. This morning's cul-de-sac, the terror of an end. What was there to bring back but a handful of dirt? If there is a pleasure in remembering, if there is a disembodied voice singing in the dark, it says, you have come this far, what next? Thank you.
climbed down to the beach facing the Pacific Ocean, where torrents of rain sure the sand. On the other side, my grandmother sleeps soundlessly in her bed, her aoyai of the whitest silk. My mother knew her mother died long before the telephone rang like bells announcing the last American helicopter leaving Saigon. Arrow shot back to its bow, long-distance missile. I know she would fly home if she could. She works overtime instead. Curls her hair with hot rollers, rouges her cheeks like Gong Li and Raise the Red Lantern, and I'm her understudy, hiding in the doorways between her grief and mine. I apply her foundation to my face. I conceal the parts of me that she conceals, puckering my lips as if to kiss a man who would want me the way I wanted to be loved. And yes, I said all their bewitching names aloud. Twisted Rose, Fuchsia in Paris, Irreverence. I picked the lipstick she would least approve. Wrapped a white towel around my waist. Danced for hours in the kitchen, checking my reflection in this charred skillet. I laughed, her laugh, the way my grandmother used to laugh when she was alive, when she taught me to pray from the dudai bee, when I braided her hair in the unbearable heat, my tiny fingers weaving each silver strand into a fishtail, a French twist, each knot another child she never got to name. I'm sorry. Mother of my mother, immortal Buddha with 1,000 hands chewing a fist of beetroot, your teeth black as dawn, no child in our family stays a child that their mother can love. Thank you so much, everyone, for being here. Thank you so much to the bookstore, to Carol for having us, and to Angelo for reading with me, and inviting a girl on this journey. Thank you so much. And thank you to the folks at home on the Zoom screen. Wish you were here. My name is Paul. The poems in my book, they began about 9 years ago when I was raped in college, and that experience forced me to reckon with having been molested as a child and with sexual assault that has been part of the story of the women in my family for many generations, beginning with the French Indochina War and the American War in Vietnam. But the word trauma does not appear anywhere in this book, and the word rape does not appear anywhere in this book, because I wanted this to be a book about survival, a book about love, a book about whether the knowledge that we are worthy of these things, that one person, even if they're queer, trans, a person of color, a child of refugees, that one person can redefine what survival means on their own terms, for their own purposes. I have one of my mentors sitting over my shoulder right now, and the question that was asked to me was whether or not I even wanted to persist, whether I wanted to change my life. So this is Galilea. I thought I could stop time by taking apart this clock, minute hand, hour hand. Nothing can keep, nothing is kept, only kept track of. I felt passing seconds accumulate like dead calves in a thunderstorm of the mind, no longer mine, but a page torn out of the dictionary with the definition of the word self effaced. I could not face it. The world moving on as if nothing happened. Everyone I knew got up, got dressed, they went to work, they went home, there were parties, ecstasy, Hennessy, dancing around each other, bluntness, blunts rolled to keep thought after thought from roiling inside me like wind across water, coercing shapelessness into shape. I put on my best face. I was glamour, yet my best could not best my beast. I too had been taken apart. I didn't want to be fixed. I wanted everything dismantled and useless, like me, case, wheel, hands, dial, face. Which are all parts of the plot, by the way. One of the most important books to me growing up was Toni Morrison's The Bluest Eye, and in that book, the main character, Pecola Breedlove, has to endure violence at home as well. And even more than that, the idea that by having the bluest eyes, she would somehow redeem her life, be accepted, be beautiful, be loved, belong. And it always resonated with me that, you know, a single idea could irrevocably change someone's view of themselves. And so something I felt I had to also do in my work is tackle the entire realm of ideas, how ideas shape people, and also the cost of how we learn about ourselves. And an example of this is 1959 at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. There was a psychologist, Henry Harlow, who separated baby monkeys at birth from their mothers, and he put them into one of two chambers. The first chamber, both had these surrogate substitute mothers in the form of dolls. And the first chamber had a doll made out of wire and a bottle of milk. And in the second chamber, there was a doll made out of terry cloth, the cloth that constitute our towels, but no bottle of milk. And over 157 days, he found that the monkeys, the babies in this first chamber, although they were nourished, they could not be reunited with their families. They could not stand to see another moving, living being. Whereas the monkeys, the babies in the second chamber, although they were malnourished, they were so excited to run into the arms of another. And it was out of this experiment that we learn about parent-child contact, about attachment theory, and yet I always thought how those babies suffered. And so this poem takes its voice from those monkeys, or borrows the voice of those monkeys. Scientific method. Of course, I chose the terry cloth surrogate. Milkless artifice, false idol. Everyone, I'm told, has a mother. But my master bred me in a laboratory. His colony of orphans, they called me rhesus macaque, macaca mulatta, old world monkeys, but my matriarchs ruled the grasslands and forests long before white men like him weaned their whiteness and maleness from our chromosomes, slashed and burned our homes, what they once called the Orient, French Indochina, Vietnam, master, like a good despot, besotted and dumbstruck, dying to discern the genesis of allegiance, the science of loss and love, nature versus nurture, segregated me at birth from my maker, her pelt still sopping with placental blood. In this chamber where he kept track of me, his pupils recorded my every movement, my every utterance, hoping I might evince to them some part of themselves, but I was not stupid. I knew family. I knew emaciation. Nevertheless, I picked that lifeless piece of shit because it was soft to hold. Though it couldn't hold me back, I couldn't blame it. I had what Master believed to be a psychological base of operation, emotional attachment, autonomy, everything he did and denied to me, I endured and kept for myself the one thing he yearned to discover and take credit for. Love, like me, is a beast no master can maim. No dungeon can discipline. Love is master and dungeon, so do not underestimate me. Simple-minded and subservient as I might appear to be, I gathered more about my master than he ever did about me, which, I guess, is a kind of fidelity, conceived not from fondness, but my fear, magnified by my fascination. Master made me his terry cloth surrogate, his red clawed god, nursing his ego on my tits, and for that, I pitied him. All this time, he was the animal. All this time, he belonged to me. Sometimes I think there are things I cannot write about because the people they involve and the people I love are still alive. And I love them too much to put them through my version of events, whether or not I think my version of events are more accurate, or whether or not I think I have to say my part because theirs has been the accepted version of history, whether it is the state version of what happened during the Vietnam War, or whether it's simply you know, my family's version of what happened to us when I was growing up, you know? And I find that in poetry, something that liberates me is this idea of lyric indirection, that we can write about things without actually having to say it. And so when my students ask, girl, why are you writing a poem about monkeys? And I'm like, you know, it's of course about being a child, having a man hurt me, and creating this distance between me and my mother, yes. But it's also about that actual event in history itself, allowing for the subjects of that experiment to say what they could not say under those conditions. And also during this pandemic, being inside, being in quarantine, being isolated, not knowing when we could leave the house, when we could touch another person, be with the people we love. That reminds me of what those days had to go through in those 157 days. And so there's something about poetry that allows for multiple stories to coexist at one time. And it's not a matter of hiding, it's not a matter of cowardice. I think it's using language to be more capacious, to contain more than we think it can. And even when, I don't know, even when in my own life I can't find examples for what it means to survive, I have things like poetry, I have things like literature and art, and I don't know, it helps to remind me that even in an era like 1620, there was an artist named Artemisia Gentileschi who was one of the first women of her time to testify in public court before her abuser. And that even though she lost, she went on to paint this incredible portrait of the biblical figure Judith, who, when her village was invaded by soldiers, she and her maidservant sneaks into the tent of the general. And in the middle of the night, she seduces him, and she also beheads him. And in some way, I imagine Artemisia there at her canvas thinking, this is the revenge of the end. This is how I can tell my story. So this next poem borrows its voice from the figure Judith in the painting by Artemisia. It's Judith slaying Holofernes. I know better than to leave the house without my good dress, my good knife, like a crucifix between my stone breasts. My mother, oh, she would have me whipped for that. She'd have me kneel on rice until I shrilled so loud I rang the church bells. Didn't I tell you? She would remind me that elegance is our revenge, that there are neither victims nor victors, but the bitch we envy. In the end, I am that bitch. I'm so dogged, so damn not even death wanted me. He sent me back after you sacked my body the way your army sacked my village, stacked our headless idols in the river where our children impaled themselves on rocks. I exit night. I enter your tent, gilded in this bolt of stubborn sunlight, my sleeves already rolled up, and I know what they'll say. I'm a slut for showing this much skin, this irreverence for what is seen when I ask to be seen. Go look at me. My thigh lifts from your thigh. My mouth spits poison into your mouth. You're the nasty beauty. I'm no beast, but when my blade slides clean through your thick neck while my maid keeps your blood off me in my good dress, it will be a song the parish sings for centuries. Tell Mary. Tell Eve. Tell Salome and David about me, and watch all their faces, like yours, turn green. Do one last poem. I was on a plane watching Finding Nemo, and I tell my students that anything at all can go into a poem. And I wanted to take that challenge on for myself and think, how am I put Finding Nemo into a poem? And there's this scene in Finding Nemo where they encounter this anglerfish, which lives in the deep sea, which is a part of the ocean that we know less about than we know about the moon. And somehow through evolution, these anglerfish who have never encountered sunlight, never known what's the sun or what light was, created their own, that little, yes, for the folks on Zoom, everyone in the audience is nodding their heads. And hopefully for the folks in the audience that want on Zoom is nodding their heads. So you all know what I mean. The little, light thing, they figured out how to make that. how to give themselves what they needed in order to survive. And I was like, that's a poem. That's how Finding Nemo's coming into this, to this book. And I thought about all the people I loved and who have stood by me through the years, and how under the most difficult circumstances, we gave each other what we needed to live. And oftentimes that was each other. And so it's a poem about finding Nemo, it's a poem about fish, it's a poem about life, it's also a poem about friendship, sisterhood, love. And so just thank you to everyone for being here and for offering that bioluminescence. And I'm gonna read like this as a promo, I'm told by my team to do so that everyone knows what the book looks like. And if you haven't, please go get it from your local bookstore. Thank you. Bioluminescence. There's a dark so deep beneath the sea. The creatures beget their own light. This feat, this fact of adaptation, I could say, is beautiful. Okay, but the creatures, they're hideous. Lantern fish, hatchet fish, viper fish. I, not unlike them, forfeited beauty to glimpse the world hidden by eternal darkness. I subsisted on falling matter, unaware from where or why matter fell, and on those weaker creatures, beguiled by my luminosity, my hideous face opening suddenly to take them in to a darkness darker and more eternal than this underworld under water. I swam and swam toward nowhere and nothing. I, after so much isolation, so much indifference, kept going, even if going meant only waiting, hovering in place so far below, so far away from the rest of life, the earth made possible by and thereby dependent upon light. I did what I had to do. I stopped. I killed. I just wanted to feel in my body at work, working to stay alive. I kept going. I swam, I waited, I found myself without meaning to, without contriving any meaning at the time, in the company of creatures who, hideous like me, had to be their own illumination, their own God, their own Genesis, and often we feuded. Often we fused like anglerfish, blood to blood, desire to desire. We were wild, bewildered, beautiful in our wilderness and our wildness in the most extreme conditions. We proved that life can exist. I exist. I am my life, I thought, approaching at last the bottom of the sea. It wasn't the bottom. It wasn't the sea. Thank you so much.
Thank you both so much for reading. Do you want to do a short Q&A? Okay, let's do it. Do you all mind standing over here?
I can also bring this chair.
Oh, perfect. Let's do that. So I have a question for both of you. And it's, what advice would you offer to a young poet?
Angela has much more experience.
Like in this domain, yes.
I'm young.
I'm Rilke and you're the young poet.
Yeah.
Okay, tell us your letters. Give us your letters.
Letter number 5. Advice to a young poet? I guess I would attempt to find your own tribe. My tribe I found in the library of my school during lunch, which was where the supernatural texts were situated next to the poetry texts. And so we found each other that way. Someone was reading The Golden Bow and I was reading Anne Sexton. And then we started to share stories and share poetry. And you'll find that now people want to know about how do I get into an MFA program, and which program should I attend, et cetera, and you'll find that the most important part of an MFA program is your cohort and who becomes your tribe and your friends, who sustains you throughout the years. And so I guess finding people that you trust, that will be your light and help you to continue to write, because for me writing is very torturous and painful. And it's something that I can go years without doing. Like Louise Glick says, I would rather wash the dishes. And so having friends there who force me to return to it is really helpful.
A couple of years ago, I had the chance to teach this really, really great class at Washington University in St. Louis that were full of Scorpios. And they had a Scorpio group chat trying to figure out what my astrological sign was. And I for a long time thought I was a Libra rising until I figured out, because the class forced me to do my chart on on the internet, and figured out I was also a Scorpio rising. They came up with this incredible acronym that a poem has to be deep, the discovery and enactment of an emotional or psychological investigation. And I remember that forever because I love acronyms. And it makes sense to me because I used to think that I went to a poem to tell my story, to tell my truth, but that wasn't enough. If I went to the poem to say simply what I know, I do not leave changed by the time the poem is done. I have to learn something about my experience, something that makes it worth sharing with the world. And so that's the discovery part. And as far as the enactment goes, poetry is not, we distinguish ourselves from our sisters, prose and so forth, because we have to make something happen with language, right? All of these poetic devices, imagery, simile, rhyme, they're not there simply to be decorative. We use them to make something happen. For example, when I teach Robert Hayden's Those Winter Sundays, there's this long sentence. When the rooms were warm, he'd call, and slowly I would rise and dress, fearing the chronic angers of that house. Speaking indifferently to him who had driven out the cold and polished my good shoes as well. And if I'm teaching, for example, syntax in this poem, when we map out the parts of that sentence, it goes father's kindness, violence, response to violence, kindness. And that is not only the Greek rhetorical figure of chiasmus, which signals psychological entrapment, it's also the complement sandwich that survivors use to talk about their abusers. He did this terrible thing, but he was also great in these other ways. At the level of how that sentence was constructed, that speaker, right, who's a vector for perhaps Hayden himself, is saying, is making a truth happen without actually having to say it, using language to make something happen. And so I think my advice for young writers would be, of course we come to the art to tell our story, but we also have to discover something, and we have to use the art to make something happen. More pop-quiz questions.
Pop-quiz questions?
I have a question on the topic of teaching. I was wondering how, for both of you, teaching impacts or influences your process of writing.
I teach better when I become a better poet.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's just how it goes. And in order to I tell my students that for me, because of who I am and where I come from, the identities that I inhabit, I know that for a long time, this country has not seen people like me as even being human. And so how do we make the argument for our humanity in a poem? It's the successful mapping of our interior life in the poem. Because if you tell, and what is the interior life? Your feelings, your thoughts, your beliefs, your biases, prejudice, all those things. If you make that argument you have to be human to have the inner life, to have a consciousness, to have a subconsciousness, an ego, all those things. And so if they can successfully do that, bring a voice to the page that is their own idiosyncratic voice, bring a subjectivity to the page that is their own singular one, they're making the argument for their humanity. And they also find ways that they have, I don't know, given into, received ideas. So like if I have students writing about heartbreak, I'm like, how do you know what heartbreak is? How do you know what love is? Whose definition, whose terms? And as I see them sharpen those definitions, as I see them be inventive and spectacular in the poems they write, I have to be even, you know what? Like, it makes me rise to the occasion. And so it's symbiotic. I have to be a better poet to teach them better. They make me a better poet so that I can teach them better. It's, I don't know, it's a blessed wheel.
Well, I also find that I become a better person when I'm a teacher, when I have to embody that space. And I also do enjoy that moment when students realize something, right? When you're forcing them to question, and sometimes I forget what that feels like because it happens so long, and then you sort of become accustomed to your life and fall into your slumber. And so it's nice to be remembered that I too need to wake up sometimes and question these ideas that I've arrived to, which I think are fundamentally my own, but perhaps are not. The same way that a 19-year-old in my classroom thinks they have an idea about love or sorrow or loss, but when we sit down and when we become contrarian with each other, we sort of arrive at newer ideas. So, yeah. Are you thinking about becoming a teacher?
Toy with it, but.
Thank you so much for the beautiful reading. Let's give the poets another round of applause. There are books for sale. The poets will be signing books. Thank you, everybody, for coming.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You could just move some of the chairs up against the wall. That would be great.